Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about the MCU, in particular Spider-Man's, rogue gallery of villains in the MCU, in particular, like which ones we could possibly see in the future, or rather which ones I'd like to see, and whether or not we would actually see them in the MCU at all. So let me break down exactly what I'm talking about, because obviously there have been 5 previous Spider-Man movies, or 6 including Homecoming, that have done a lot of things. So I'm wondering, there's certain villains I feel like they'd be less likely to do just because they've already been done in a movie format. Like, for example, Green Goblin, which Green Goblin I put at the top of Spider-Man's rogue gallery, in a sense of probably him and Venom are up there as to being kind of, I know, switching avenues, but the comparison between where Batman has his Joker, I feel like definitely Venom, but I feel like Green Goblin can compete for being that well-known arch enemy on that same level, because he's an antagonist I grew up watching a lot because of the animated Spider-Man cartoon from the 90s. But because he was the main antagonist of the first Spider-Man movie, in the first Spider-Man movie with the Sam Raimi stuff, and then Harry became the Goblin in the 3rd movie, and then kind of similar thing happens in the Amazing Spider-Man 2 where Harry becomes the Green Goblin, so they'd be less likely to do that villain in particular, which I'm wondering, is that something they would not do at all, or would it be much later on in the movie? Because I remember even before Spider-Man Homecoming came out, they had talked about the fact is that all the Spider-Man movies would focus on all 4 years of Peter in high school. So maybe that's something that could happen later on. And the same thing applies to other villains. It's because Doc Ock was used, would we be less likely to see that? Because the Lizard was used, would we be less likely to see that? Obviously, there's the whole Venom situation because of, depending on probably how well the Venom movie does, also where it stands, because I think I was looking it up just the other day. They still don't know where the Venom movie was going to fall or something like that. Whether it was going to be a PG-13 movie or an R. I had not really paid too much attention to it before. Now, it never really clicked in my head, because I was like, yeah, because if it's R-rated, transferring that over to the MCU, if they ever got to that point and ever did that, it'd probably be a little bit hard. They'd have to probably tone down a lot of the movie in that regard. So I don't know, we'll ultimately wait and see. Same thing for Rhino too, because he was kind of popped up at the end of the Amazing Spider-Man 2. So would they be quick to do that again? Because I was watching something that was kind of oh, because of this blah blah blah, this might be hinting that they're setting up the Sinister Six, which, something that the Amazing Spider-Man 2 was doing. What about Electro? He falls under that same category as well. You get the point I'm trying to make. It's kind of interesting, because if that is the case, it only applies in the movies, because the video games don't shy away from the fact is that they're willing to just reuse villains and kind of reinterpret them in different ways and stuff like that. I mean, because this movie was the first, Spider-Man Homecoming in particular was the first movie that the Vulture popped up in. I think he was teased in Amazing Spider-Man 2, and I think that's kind of interesting. Maybe that's what kind of led them to decide to do Vulture, was because of that aspect. For one, he hadn't been ever introduced on screen. They to my recollection, it was his wings that were shown. It was kind of oh, that's what they're setting up. So they had a little more wiggle room with that, but everything else had physically popped up in the movies, and those villains had their entire movies, or they played a part in the movie. But with the video games, and that's kind of another side of this whole thing where a lot of people have their concerns, because it's oh, Spider-Man 3 or the Amazing Spider-Man 2, people feel like you're setting up too many villains because you've already got Vulture established. You also technically have Scorpion established too, because I talked about this when I rewatched Spider-Man Homecoming. The fact is that the guy at the end, I think the actor's name is Michael Mondo. He's the dude at the end asking, is oh, so you know who Spider-Man is, which Vulture doesn't. Well, he does, but he says he doesn't. That's Scorpion, which I didn't know that until after I'd watched Spider-Man Homecoming the first time. But then you look at the video games, in particular, look at the Insomniac Spider-Man game, which, interesting enough, is coming out September 7th. That's the same day that Iron Fist Season 2 is dropping on Netflix. I doubt that was a planned thing. It's just funny to me that kind of worked out like that. But from the E3 trailer, it showed they kind of got a Sinister Six thing going on, because Rhino's there, Vulture's there, Electro's there, and so it's just kind of that interesting aspect of it's okay in video games, because the way video games are designed, you can let multiple villains breathe, whereas a movie, a lot of it's condensed and it just gets overcrowded, and I think a lot of people have concerns about that. Me personally, I interpret that as well, I mean, once again, the Scorpion thing, they've set him up. It's not like he actually has his suit right now. Doesn't mean they have to jump to it. I mean, I feel like that's probably something they'll probably save for the 3rd or 4th movie. Maybe not. Maybe they do it sooner. But I feel like it's because like you have this extended universe, you know, which is weird for me to say. This cinematic universe, I should specifically say, that you can set stuff up in and just not use yet. Once again, a perfect example is Thanos. Literally sat in the background for so long. Guardians of the Galaxy 1, Volume 1 was like the first time we ever got to get a good look, extended look at him. But even then, he didn't really do much in the movie. It wasn't until Infinity War that we really got Thanos in the MCU as, you know, the doing stuff, you know? So that's the thing. Just because you set this character up doesn't mean you're going to use them immediately. It could just be like, you're setting them up and you're going to use them much later on because you have the room to breathe, extend stuff out too, you know? Because at the time of me recording this, the main villain that a lot of people are saying is going to be the main villain of Spider-Man Far From Home is going to be Mysterio, which is interesting because that's a character that hasn't been used, kind of going back to what I was talking about. He hasn't made an on-screen appearance yet. He's kind of one of Spider-Man's, I feel like, well-known villain. Be curious to see what they do with it, because like if it was Mysterio, because the whole illusions thing, that'd be kind of a mind trip of a movie. Like you could really do a like almost Doctor Strange level of crazy stuff to a certain extent, like it'd all be illusions and stuff like that. But I think you could fiddle with that a little bit. I'd be curious to see how they would handle it. Granted, that's what's I've seen the most. I saw someone else hinted at, like someone suggesting it was Hydro Man. I want to say it was Nerdist who was suggesting it might be Hydro Man. I didn't see the video. It was just kind of like the thumbnail and the title and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, that'd be interesting. That's a villain I've rarely seen a lot of. My only experience with him was the 90s Spider-Man cartoons too, so I just think that's kind of interesting. The one that I've always kind of wanted and I thought would kind of be pretty neat for movies is Kraven, because once again, I will always give them credit. It was like source-fed nerd at some point in time. I think it was during some of their superhero roundup podcasts or something. They had suggested him as a villain, and I always ran with it because I was like, man, that's a good idea, because you can have this aspect of always being hunted, like Peter freaking out about it. It add a very different like feel for the movie, kind of give the movie kind of like a, it's weird to make this comparison, but maybe kind of like a Predator feel to it, because it's like you're always being hunted, you never feel safe type of thing. Going back to that Hydro Man situation too, like it's kind of interesting because like once again I brought it up, my experience is the 90s Spider-Man cartoon. Like there's some interesting arcs connected to Hydro Man, in particular stuff connected in him and Mary Jane. Like I'll just leave it at that. But if you're familiar with the arc I'm talking about, like I'm curious, will they do something like that in the movies? I doubt it, but I don't know if that's traditionally an arc he has in the comic books or not. It's also interesting too because we're talking about the whole MCU as a whole, which I find fascinating. It's the whole aspect of Wilson Fisk when you actually break it down. Technically he exists in the MCU. He doesn't exist in the movies, but he exists on the Netflix TV shows, you know, played by Vincent D'Onofrio in Daredevil, which is kind of interesting because for me, Wilson Fisk, I knew him first as a Spider-Man villain. He's actually subsequently popped up in stuff like, I think, the Amazing Spider-Man 2 video game. He's even in Insomniac's Spider-Man game that's coming out too. At least like they kind of showed him in one of the E3 trailers. But part of me wonders, is he actually like a Daredevil villain traditionally? Did he start off as one? Is that how he was introduced? Because he subsequently has popped up multiple times as like a Daredevil thing, because obviously in the movie with Ben Affleck back in like 2003, he was played by Michael Clark Duncan. But then also like now you have it on the TV show too, so it makes me go like, oh, so he must be traditionally a Daredevil villain, I'm assuming. Like obviously with these type of things, whether it be Marvel or DC, a lot of people share a lot of villains. Like kind of going down a different avenue once again, using the DC comparison, like Ra's al Ghul or Ra's al Ghul. Once again, I was first introduced to him as a Batman villain years ago in a like animated series from the 90s, and he has subsequently popped up in like Batman Begins, and that also plays a role with the whole Talia situation and The Dark Knight. But he's also popped up in Gotham, but I've kind of more recently known him as a Green Arrow antagonist because he was the main antagonist of season 3. But to me, that's just something, because it's just kind of an interesting thing, because that's one antagonist at least we probably would never see. Once again, it's because the, you know, movies never really dive into any of the stuff that the TV show, you know, set up and stuff like that. So we would never see like a Wilson Fisk, because, you know, Marvel doesn't step on its own toes like that, which, you know, I've talked about before, the whole DC thing of like, oh yeah, Ezra Miller as the Flash in the movies and Grant Gustin on the Arrowverse, you know, CW as the Flash. So, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, it's just one of those things that Marvel isn't really doing, so I don't know if they'd ever do that. They probably wouldn't. This is just kind of like a mess of a video because I'm just like all over the place with this whole thing, but that's just kind of my thought process behind everything, like possible villains I'd like to see and whether or not we would see some of them. Ultimately, those are just kind of some thoughts flowing around my head. Ultimately, my question to you is, do you kind of agree with what I'm thinking, my thought process, because we saw these villains so slightly fresh, especially those from the Amazing Spider-Man? Would we be less likely to see them in the MCU? Or would they, you know, just give it time to buffer out and then they'll do them themselves? Or do you think, you know, they have no plans at all? Just let me know kind of your thoughts, you know, in the comments down below. But really, that's all I want to talk about in this video. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.